I mean, I have to say, I think it's one of the most ill thought out military escapades of recent times.
The government is suggesting that, well, someone may be employing someone who's here illegally at the moment, but as soon as they discover they don't have this digital ID, the correct app on their phone, they're going to be up in arms.
We need an Islamism strategy rather than an Islamophobia strategy. We need a government that is devoted to wheedling out not anti-Muslim hostility, but the anti-Western hostility, the anti-British hostility that has taken hold amongst certain sections of society.
Hello and welcome back to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. No Tom Slater this week, but I'm thrilled to be joined instead by Spike's Chief Political Writer, Brendan O'Neill. Welcome, Brendan.
How you doing?
Doing good. Great to have you on. And also joined by one of our favourite returning guests, writer and trade unionist Paul Embry. Paul, welcome.
Good to be with you.
Now, we've got plenty to discuss today. We'll be talking about the Iran war in week 2, Keir Starmer's bonfire of civil liberties, and the ban on Islamophobia. So we're now into the second week of the Iran war. I think it's fair to say that it feels a little bit incoherent as to what the American strategy is. Donald Trump has declared victory this week, and yet in the days following that, we've seen some of the most intense bombardments on Tehran. And sometimes it feels like, depending on what day you ask him, if you speak to him or you speak to Marco Rubio or you listen to Pete Hegseth, they'll come up with a different explanation as to what this war is about, what their aims are, what their objectives are. Paul, is that sense you get that this war is slightly incoherent and that is potential for some real danger there? I
mean, I have to say, I think it's one of the most ill thought out military escapades of recent times. I mean, the objectives, as we can see, keep on shifting. 1 minute, Trump is talking about unconditional surrender. He's talking about the Iranians taking over your own government. He's saying that, it's about regime change. And then the next day he says something else. He says the war is, almost complete or very complete, he said at one stage, even though none of that stuff has happened. And you kind of ask yourself, well, is this some kind of extremely clever strategy? Or is it just that they're making it up as they go along? And I have to say, it seems to me that they're making it up as they go along. I think, it almost, the way that they've launched and prosecuted this war, it makes George Bush and Tony Blair look restrained, to be perfectly blunt. I mean, I should stress, I've got no time for the theocratic regime in Iran. I think Iranians would be better without that regime. I say that unequivocally. But I don't think that, simply bombing a country is the way to go about doing these things or bringing liberation to the people of the country. And what it looks like doing potentially in this case is actually uniting Iranians behind the Ayatollah's regime. It's hard to see how, if one of the objectives is to deplete the nuclear capability of Iran, it's hard to see how you can judge that when you don't actually have boots in the ground in the country. We're seeing, it was reported today that around 3 million Iranians have been displaced. And of course, we're looking at a worldwide economic catastrophe. It seems that no one within the US administration thought that actually the Strait of Hormuz would be choked, and what that might mean for the rest of the world, what that might mean for the price of oil and the knock-on effects of the economy, which, look like being calamitous. So it's been, I think, an absolute folly in the truest sense of the word. And I think the world, not just Iran, but the world, or not just the Iranian people, I should say, but the world is going to pay, I suspect, a heavy price for it.
And Brendan, I mean, no one sane would shed any tears for the Iranian regime. It's nothing, maybe even something to celebrate the fact that some of those nasty tyrants have been killed. I mean, there are reports today that Ali Khamenei's son is in hospital in a coma and still directing the war from there, allegedly. But at the same time, externally imposed regime change comes with some quite serious risks and can often backfire and has unintended consequences and doesn't work out in the kind of stable democratic way that we might want it to, in a way that an internal revolution might.
Yeah, there's definitely incoherence in Trump's strategy, which is not that surprising given it's Donald Trump. I mean, he's not known for his acumen in political or military affairs. I think most people would accept that. And I agree, externally imposed regime change rarely works out. That's the lesson of the past 20 years for sure. If you want a regime to be changed, then you've got to trust the people within that regime to do it themselves. That's really the only way that it can happen in a healthy, democratic fashion. But where I slightly differ from Paul, I think, is that, even given the coherence, I think that the military incoherence in what's happening in Iran at the moment is kind of finds its echo in a moral incoherence in the West. And I do think that there's this kind of atmosphere of moral defeatism around this war, which is really starting to worry me. I'm not saying that that's what Paul is giving voice to there. But if you look at like the BBC coverage, for example, or across the media and across sections of the radical left, there's this idea that this is the biggest calamity of recent decades. It's going to be an apocalypse. The economy is going to collapse. The world is going to collapse. The region is going to be propelled into hell. I mean, maybe all those things will happen. Who knows? But I just think it's too early to judge. And I think there is this kind of slightly defeatist attitude. And you almost get the impression that some people want Israel and America to be taught a lesson. I mean, watching the BBC nightly news at the moment, it's like one long smirk at the troubles that America has brought on itself with this war. There's this kind of very off-putting culture in relation to the war. So even though the war worries me, all wars worry me, and they should worry all of us, the opposition to this war is worrying me as well, because I do think it has become a slightly fear-driven approach, which at times I think there is a danger of the media underestimating what's at stake in this theatre of conflict. And there are some pretty big questions at stake here. And I think any kind of victory for the Islamic Republic would be very bad indeed for that region. So I just think it's worth us taking a step back and looking at the broader picture if the war, hopefully, is swiftly brought to an end or swiftly won. And then I think we can have a fresher discussion about what this was all about.
Paul, there may be some things you want to come back to, but I would also like to talk about what this means for the UK. I think, although the UK is not involved militarily in this war, I still think it has exposed a lot of our internal weaknesses. Whether we would want to be involved or not is almost a moot point when it's taken, for instance, 2 weeks to get a single military ship ready to send to the Mediterranean just to defend a British sovereign base in Cyprus. Or you think about the oil crisis that you alluded to. We feel it's as if we're especially exposed to that after decades of negligence towards our energy supplies. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that sense. What it's telling us about Britain, our place in the world, and our sort of deep structural problems.
Yeah, I mean, I will come back just on a couple of things that Brendan mentioned. Look, I don't think there's any doubt that if the Iranian regime somehow pull off some kind of victory, or even just perceived to have pulled off some sort of victory, it will embolden them and it will undermine the democratic opposition forces inside of Iran. And that's not something I think that many of us would want to see. But there's a converse to that as well, that if the US and Israel you'd pull off a victory, and I'd say that chance seems a little bit slimmer. And whilst I accept that you often can't make judgments after just a couple of weeks of a military intervention, I think the difference with this war is simply because of what's happening economically, internationally, to the price of oil. It ups the stakes very quickly, and it means that there will be enormous pressure on Trump to kind of get out of the situation very quickly, because otherwise we are potentially going to see a real dire economic situation. So I do sort of understand that, but the other side of it is that if the US and Israel are seen to win this, then what that does, I think, is almost emboldens anyone who has the idea, look, you can just launch what I think is an illegal war when there isn't an imminent threat to your country. and you can pull off a victory and everyone's going to applaud you, and you'll be confident about doing the same thing again. So I think it's almost a bit of a plague on both your houses situation, in terms of the potential outcome, whether it's the White House and Netanyahu who are seen as the victors, or whether it's the Ayatollah and his regime who are seen as the victors. And if I could just make another point as well. Look, I was one of the few people, I think, on the left who didn't go into meltdown when Trump came to power, either the first time or the second time. I think, a lot of my colleagues on the left who, said that this was the dawn of a new age of fascism. I thought that was nonsense then. I think it's nonsense now. And in many respects, I saw Trump, although I wouldn't have voted for him personally and didn't particularly like him, I saw him as a bit of an antidote, if you like, to the sort of globalist, technocratic, hyper-liberal agenda that had come to dominate the upper echelons of political institutions throughout the Western world. And I think that, that he had the ability potentially to take on that sentiment of national populism that had arisen in America and throughout the West. He talked about reindustrialization, the importance of a domestic industrial base. He'd challenged the woke agenda. He'd done some of that, and some of that stuff I think was really important. But in many respects, he's the worst advocate for his own cause, because, I mean, look, he's on a personal level, he's a complete oaf. I don't think anyone can really dispute that. But I think doing something like this, launching this kind of military escapade with all the lies and the shifting objectives and, this type of thing, particularly when he pledged to end the forever wars, I think has set that cause back in many respects. We wanted to see him take that cause on and make a case for, if you like, the unspoken for millions, people in the Rust Belt, blue collar America, just as there are people in the Red Wall in blue collar Britain. And I think he's failed to do that, or any ability he's going to have to do that has been eclipsed by mad stuff like this, unfortunately. Coming to your other point, Fraser. Yeah. Look, I mean, we are an undeveloping country in Britain. There's no doubt about that. Things don't work as they should do. We've got a housing crisis. The economy is cooked. The police can't police the streets. The prisons are overflowing. So when we find that actually we can't get a ship to the Middle East in good time, I don't think anyone is particularly surprised by it. When you go back 40 years ago to the Falklands, and that the task force set sail in pretty short order, and you look at what we're trying to do now, I think it does highlight just how just the level of decline that we're in. On the wider, broader political point, I'd say I do think Starmer was right to resist Trump, and I think that Farage and Badenoch, who were arguing that we should go all in right at the beginning, I think have been left with a bit of egg on their face. And I'm not one to usually praise Starmer, but I do think he deserves a bit of credit on this for the way he's handled it politically.
And certainly Farage at least has pulled back from his initial position, definitely. Brendan, before we move on to other topics, I just wanted to talk a bit about the home front. I mean, in terms of, you're talking earlier about the opposition to the war, some of the opposition is frankly coming from Islamists who are in favor of the Islamic regime, and there is due to be this Al-Quds march on Sunday, which was started by the first Ayatollah, the Al-Quds Day parade, and that has been banned, but looks like some element of the march is going to go ahead. I mean, what have you made of that aspect of things where, you have seen outright, mourning for the Ayatollahs, praise for the clerics? I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, the home front worries me enormously. I mean, the battlefront is its own thing, and it's hard to work out what's actually happening in Iran. My default approach to all wars is to take everything with a pinch of salt, because misinformation is notorious in wartime. I mean, we all know that from history, that it's hard to work out, to see through the fog of war. So it's difficult to know what is actually happening in Iran. How successful have the strikes against the regime been? How many civilians have died? All these things are incredibly difficult to work out, and will be for some time. But on the home front, I think we can see pretty clearly that we've got a problem in the West, including in Britain. We've got people in our society who are egging on the Islamic Republic, who want Iran to win. I mean, some people are openly saying it, some people are actually just implying it. But, amongst Islamists and certain leftists, and even I would say within the media culture, there is this almost this desire to see America get a bloody nose, to see Trump put back in his box, to see the populist project more broadly be shamed in front of the world. I mean, I do think people are putting a lot of emphasis on this war because they want those outcomes in the West, regardless of what happens in the region itself. Yeah, so the home front, I think, is very worrying. But, the thing I would say to those people protesting against this war, which they are perfectly at liberty to do, one thing I would very much push back on is the idea that this is another Iraq. I mean, Iraq was a complete calamity, as was the bombing of Libya. We covered in depth on Spite the extraordinarily destructive impact that those wars had. Both of them were unjust wars. Now, this might turn out to be an equally destructive conflict. We just don't know. But it's not the same thing. And when I hear people say that it's an unprovoked war, I kind of just want to grab them by the scruff of the neck because, the Islamic Republic gives hundreds of millions of dollars to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to the Houthis. I mean, it arms them, it funds them, it directs them, it celebrates them on the streets of Tehran. These are movements that have been raining missiles on Israel for the past 3 years, which invaded Israel and killed 1,200 people, as everyone knows. I mean, the Islamic Republic is a regime that has directed armies to invade an ally of ours. And some of the people that these movements have killed have been British citizens. 18 British citizens were killed on 7th of October. So we are involved in this, whether we want to be or not. And the Islamic Republic is a threat in the way that Saddam Hussein wasn't. That war was driven by lies and hyperbole about the threat that Saddam posed to the West. But the Islamic Republic does pose a threat. Now, that doesn't mean the solution is, banging the drum for a Trump-led war. I mean, you couldn't get a worse wartime leader than Trump, probably. But it does mean that we have to take seriously what's at stake here and the fact that Britain is part of this, whether we want to be or not. And that doesn't mean we have to join the war. I don't think we should. And I don't think we really have the capacity to do so anyway. But it does mean just thinking about the fact that this is a real war, a serious war. This is not like one of those kind of so-called humanitarian escapades of the past few years. There are real things at stake here. And I just think it's paying attention to that and encouraging a kind of more sane debate on the home front would probably be a good thing right now.
When bringing an idea to life, whether it's a podcast, a publication, or your own brand, it's easy to find yourself overwhelmed by the amount of roles you have to play. Instead of just being the creative mind, suddenly you're the accountant, the IT guy, the social media manager, and logistics coordinator all rolled into one. It's no wonder that so many business owners feel like it's just a bit too much. But that's where Shopify steps in. Shopify powers millions of businesses globally and handles 10% of all US e-commerce, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to first-time entrepreneurs. Shopify gives everyone the tools to make their business idea into a reality. Whatever your product or business looks like, Shopify has everything you need to make it happen. You can choose from hundreds of ready-to-go templates that will make your store look sleek and professional, without the additional cost of hiring a graphic designer. Plus, Shopify's AI features make life easy by generating product descriptions, attention-grabbing headlines, and even enhancing your product photos in just a few clicks. Finding customers is just as simple. Shopify can help you launch email campaigns and social media ads, totally hassle-free. And behind the scenes, Shopify handles all the essentials that keep a business running, including inventory, shipping, and returns. Ready to bring your idea to life? Whether it's a product, a passion project, or your next big venture, Shopify is ready for you. So, turn your big business idea into with Shopify on your side. Sign up now for your £1 per month trial period and start selling today at shopify.co.uk/spiked. Go to shopify.co.uk/spiked. That's shopify.co.uk/spiked. Let's talk about Labour's war on civil liberties. In just the past week, Labour has refreshed or restarted its campaign for digital ID. There's going to be a big public consultation. We're going to get it whether we like it or not. We're just going to be asked how best to implement it. Parliament has voted in favour of scrapping jury trials in certain criminal cases. And also, the Labour government has unveiled its definition of anti-Muslim hostility, aka Islamophobia. We'll come on to the Islamophobia stuff a bit later on, because I think there's a bit of a broader discussion there to have. But Paul, does it alarm you that this government doesn't seem to have achieved much by way of implementing its manifesto commitments, or it doesn't seem to be a traditionally socially democratic government or anything that you might expect from Labour parties or Labour governments of old? But it is steamrolling ahead with quite an authoritarian agenda against our civil liberties. That seems to be the one thing that it does manage to get through.
Yeah, and coming out with these type of policies when there was no serious public debate about them previously. They weren't in the party's manifesto, and they've just decided to launch them anyway. And it seems to me that when it comes to, let's be blunt, when it comes to digital ID, the chief reason that they want to implement that is because of the massive state failures over mass immigration going back many years. Successive governments have been completely unable, or some might say unwilling, to control our borders. We have so many people in the country now who frankly shouldn't be here. I suspect that the state doesn't know just how many people are in the country who shouldn't be here. So they argue that this is one of the ways to address that problem. So effectively what they're saying is that we all have to pay the price through a tax on our liberties, our ancient liberties, because of that state failure. And it's very questionable whether it would work anyway. I mean, if you look at France, for example, France has got ID cards, but it's still got hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants in the country. And for me, I mean, sometimes it's tempting. Sometimes it's tempting to say, okay, if this is what you think is going to allow us to protect our borders, then let's go for it. But actually, for me, the state is there to serve free and law-abiding citizens and to be answerable to us, not the other way around. And I think that tips this in terms of digital ID. I think tips the balance in that regard. And I think when it comes to jury trials as well, I mean, very, very similar situation. That actually, again, this is an ancient right, and I think, in truth, is one of the most appalling attacks on our liberties. And particularly, and you touched on it, Fraser, particularly at a time when there is this kind of increasing authoritarianism in the country, and people are being prosecuted or investigated for writing or saying or doing things that really ought not to be regarded as crimes, and put in prison for things they've written on social media, is all the more reason to actually defend trial by jury. And the argument that because there's a backlog, I think is absolutely morally bankrupt, because if something is right as a foundational principle of your justice system, which is that you should be tried by a jury, 12 men or women, 12 of your peers, then actually that's a matter of principle that can't be, I don't think, undermined simply because you've got an administrative problem of a backlog of cases. So it's an appalling attack on liberty, and there's no way I could even try to defend it.
Yeah, and you could just so easily see how that argument could just be leveled against any of our liberties and rights. I mean, it's horribly inefficient to hold elections to consult the public on anything, if you think about it that crudely. But of course, we absolutely hold dearly to that right. And on the question of illegal migration, I think it's kind of risible that the government is suggesting that, well, someone may be employing someone who's here illegally at the moment, but as soon as they discover they don't have this digital ID, the correct app on their phone, they're going to be up in arms. They're going to say, and they're going to sack them, and they're going to report them to the authorities. It just doesn't add up at all. So I think, Brendan, as well as everything else, they are kind of taking us for mugs with some of these policies.
Absolutely. As Paul says, it's like the worst of both worlds. So firstly, they basically let our borders fall apart and fail to police them, fail to exercise sovereign control over the territory and let people in willy-nilly. And then they punish us for that. They make us live with the consequences of it by, instead of policing our borders, policing us and encouraging us all to get digital ID to prove that we have the right to be in the country, etc., etc., or the right to work, rather. So yeah, it's an awful system, and it's an attempt to patch up their own failures. And I'm not surprised at all there has been so much public discontent over the digital ID idea. And then the jury trials, I mean, that is incredibly disturbing because this is an ancient right. This is a right that we've had for a very long time. It's really the most democratic aspect of justice, where ordinary people get to sit in judgment on one of their fellow citizens and to decide his or her fate. I mean, it's an entirely democratic idea. The notion is that ordinary people are more trustworthy in these cases than one judge. One often posh judge who will come from a particular part of society whose judgment might be skewed by prejudice or experience or whatever else. To counter that, we invite ordinary men and women into the justice system to use their moral muscles, their freedom of thought, their ability of, figuring things out in order to pass judgment. And to lose that is catastrophic. And it really does speak to, I think, the culture that's underlying all of these authoritarian trends, which is just this staggering culture of distrust between the government and ordinary people. They just don't trust us. They don't trust us to think for ourselves or to speak for ourselves. As Paul says, there have been numerous arrests and investigations for speech, for things people have said online. They don't trust us to weigh things up in a court of law, and they're scrapping that under the guise of speeding up the justice system. They don't trust us to go about our business, to get a job in the correct way, so they want to give us these ID cards. It's just this really poisonous culture that exists between a government that is incredibly aloof and ordinary people who it looks down upon as these, untrustworthy, difficult people who need to be continually policed and continually kept in check. I think all of these trends speak to that broader culture, and it is just the enemy of freedom when you have a government that thinks in that way.
And one thing that's particularly striking is that this is a government led by a human rights lawyer. And, you'd think normally that would mean that he'd be interested in protecting civil liberties, especially, that pertain to the justice system. But in fact, you see this strange kind of cognitive dissonance where, you both rightly say it's an ancient right. I mean, it goes right back to Magna Carta. Some historians actually say it goes even beyond that to, the Anglo-Saxons and how they dispense with justice. And yet, so there's this cavalier attitude to jury trials and things like that. But whereas the Human Rights Act or the European Convention on Human Rights, which, by comparison are basically from yesterday, are treated with this extraordinary reverence and are something that, we wouldn't dare tweak or tinker with. Paul, I don't know if you have any final thoughts on this.
Well, only to say really that, the old maxim that scratch a liberal and an authoritarian bleeds, I think, probably explains why the likes of Starmer and others who would present themselves as very liberal on these questions actually underneath it are quite authoritarian. It's certainly been my experience anyway. Definitely.
And one of the things I alluded to earlier was the anti-Muslim hostility definition. Now, this has come in. It's not illegal. It's not a criminal offence to fall foul of this definition, but it is statutory in the sense that it will apply to all public bodies. The private sector is encouraged to sign up to this. So falling foul of something that's considered to be anti-Muslim hostility could lead to job losses and kind of more civil penalties. Brendan, the government has been at pains to insist that this will have absolutely no impact on free speech. I find that completely risible. It seems as if how could the intention be anything other than to silence speech and silence criticism and questioning of particularly Islam and Islamic extremism and Islamism, which are such important and controversial topics of our time.
Absolutely. It's just a new word for Islamophobia. It's interesting because I was reading the government document and because it's published its new definition of anti-Muslim hostility, and then this accompanying document as well. And it really notably does not use the word Islamophobia. I think even these kind of cloth-eared people in power have recognized that that's become a very problematic word because it conflated criticism of Islam with bigotry against Muslims. So they've scrapped that word, but anti-Muslim hostility, it turns out, is the same thing. And if you read the definition, it is very much about because as people have pointed out, it is against the law in the UK to incite hatred against Muslims or to discriminate against Muslims, as it should be. All social groups should be protected from discrimination. I think most decent people agree with that. But this definition goes beyond those protections and talks about the problem of hostility, feeling hostile towards Muslims or certain ways in which Muslims present themselves. And if you look at the definition, it talks about words, written or spoken words that might feel intimidating or which might stereotype Muslims. Now, most people agree it's not big or clever to stereotype entire groups in society, but what if a comedian takes the piss out of the niqab? Or what about that old Boris Johnson newspaper column in which he said women in the burqa look like bank robbers and letterboxes? That might have been seen as intimidating commentary which stereotyped Muslims on the basis of their appearance. All of those things in this new definition are defined as bad things. And it will have a chilling effect on speech, even though it's not a law, and even though people will not be dragged to court to answer for their blasphemous speech. It will have a top-down effect in institutions, and I think it will have a chilling effect on how people think and speak about this religion. So it is a blasphemy law by the back door. They've just got rid of the word Islamophobia and replaced it with something else. And as you say, Fraser, we need complete freedom to talk about radical Islam, Islamism, the impact that ideology is having in certain communities, among certain constituencies. We need an Islamism a strategy rather than an Islamophobia strategy. We need a government that is devoted to wheedling out not anti-Muslim hostility, but the anti-Western hostility, the anti-British hostility that has taken hold amongst certain sections of society. And because it's incapable of doing that or unwilling to do that, instead it just brings back this Islamophobia policing. I think it's a depressing sign of the times that the government is focusing on tackling so-called blasphemy rather than tackling real extremism in our societies.
And I think, we've already seen signs that it has emboldened those who would want to silence blasphemy. I mean, it was interesting. One of the Gaza independent MPs stood up in Parliament to ask, will his fellow members of Parliament be sanctioned if they engage in anti-Muslim hostility? So immediately he interpreted it as an attack on free speech. There was a Lib Dem peer who said that anyone who says that the anti-Muslim hostility definition goes against free speech is spreading misinformation. And then she added, misinformation is a crime under the Online Safety Act, and said that people should be arrested, therefore, if they say that this definition counters free speech online. So certainly the enemies of free speech are even if they protest that it's nothing to do with censorship, they've been emboldened. Paul, what have you made of this whole episode?
Gratuitous abuse of people on the basis of their religion is obviously not a very nice thing, but I think it's clear that there are genuine, well-founded fears that this definition has the potential to stifle legitimate scrutiny of Islam as a religion and some of the customs and practices related to Islam, and to turn ineffectively to a backdoor blasphemy law where a culture will be created whereby people will just feel that it's a safer bet simply to button their lip in any discussion or debate about Islam or Muslims rather than expressing their true beliefs. And that's not a good position for any society to get itself into. And yes, while the government says, look, this is non-statutory and it's simply a guidance tool for the public and private sector, for councils, for public services, for businesses, and so on. The truth is that many of these institutions are completely obsessed with DEI ideology. Let's be blunt about it. And the people that run many of these institutions have that kind of metropolitan liberal worldview, where they do see any legitimate criticism of Islam or scrutiny of the customs of Islam or the behavior of certain Muslims as intolerant. They see anything like that as an attack on multiculturalism, which of course most of them are signed up to, and they will take a very dim view of it. And what we'll see, even if we don't see prosecutions, there's a possibility we will see people who fall foul of this definition, because some people will in these institutions, let's be blunt, cancelled or sacked or denied promotion, denied employment in the first place. That's the real danger that we get ourselves into. And of course, we absolutely defend, or certainly those of us who believe in liberty, defend the principle of freedom of religion. But as Brendan said, look, the law prevents harassment or discrimination on the grounds of religion at the moment. So this kind of bolt-on, as it were, doesn't seem necessary. And you can, we saw with the grooming gangs exactly what happens when people are fearful of raising issues around Islam and around its customs, because they are worried about inflaming community tensions, as many people in authority were, and as a result declined to raise issues when they should have done. We saw the effects of that. We don't need to repeat what happened. Suffice to say that thousands of young girls suffered at the hands of predators because of that culture of silence. And I fear genuinely that culture of silence will be exacerbated as a result of the introduction of this definition.
Brendan, is there anything you want to add before we finish on this?
Well, just thinking about the past couple of weeks since the explosion of the Iran war, I mean, we've seen evidence in our societies that we're quite divided. Four men had been arrested in London on suspicion of spying on Jewish institutions for the Islamic Republic. We've seen people on the streets chanting "Death to Israel." The Al-Quds March, we know that that's been banned, but apparently they plan to march anyway. We've seen expressions of what I would call anti-Western hostility. By the way, I defend people's right to express anti-Western hostility. I don't defend people's right to spy on behalf of a foreign nation, but I do defend people's right to march in the streets and say these things. But they are indicative of a problem in our society. And the worst thing about censorship always is that it prevents us from being honest about the problems we face. It really discourages us from being frank and open and free and outspoken about the problems in our society. And instead, it brushes everything under the carpet. And this kind of censorious approach to Islam will have the exact same impact. It will make it much more difficult for us to talk about the fraying of our so-called multicultural society, the rise of these regressive trends in certain constituencies, and it will make it harder for us to tackle it. So censorship is always a bad thing. It's always a barrier to social progress and free debate. And I think it's going to be in this case as well.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Paul. That's the end of the first half of the discussion. The second half is over on Spiked Podcast Unlocked, which is exclusive for Spike supporters. If you're not already a Spike supporter, then join us right now. Sign up. It's only £5 per month. And then you can watch the rest of this podcast. You get all kinds of other perks, get discounted tickets to events. Sign up now. You won't regret it. And we will see you there. We'll be discussing Zach Polanski's boob hypnosis.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great story. Every now and then I have the tiny twinge of sympathy for him. And I think to myself, should we leave this story alone now and let him get on with his political career? But then I remind myself that actually, if anything, he has even crazier views about women's bodies today.
And much more besides. Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back at the same time next week. In the meantime, why not subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel and then click the bell so you're always alerted whenever there's some new content. Spiked is producing more videos than ever, from podcasts like this one to interviews to our series of polemics. You really, really don't want to miss out on it. Plus, to get your daily dose of Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com. That's our website at spiked-online.com.